Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned because it's time for the Book of the Week. The Book of the Week, that spellbinding program where Roger and I will just pick up some book that's lying around and we'll talk about it. And this week, we picked up a book that is kind of obscure. You might not have heard of this one. This is A Game of Thrones. A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. The first book in a Song of Ice and Fire, a very popular fantasy series which will never end. It'll never end because George R.R. Martin is never going to finish it. Sure seems that way. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but unless Roger breaks out the Necronomicon and can use his magical powers, I'm pretty sure we're never going to actually see the conclusion of this saga, but we'll see. We'll see. Time will tell. So this book came out a long time ago. It was way back in the 90s that this book came out. This first book of A Song of Ice and Fire, this particular paperback, is the only copy of A Game of Thrones that I own. I picked this up probably in the mid-2000s. I want to say maybe 2005 or 6 or something. I picked this up at the urging of a friend of mine. My good friend Justin was a big fan of this book series. And he said, hey, you got to read these books. And so I did. At least I read the first 2 of them. When this book came out, the first 3 books had been released. We were waiting on the 4th, if I'm remembering correctly. And I read the first 2 and I thought, this is a really good series, but I think what I'll do is, I'm going to set these down, and then once George R.R. Martin finishes the series, then I'll pick them back up and I'll read them all one after another. That was the plan. Plan that will never happen. So it's about time for me to get back to this series because you know what? This first book was really, really good. I remember being very impressed by it. It is, of course, an epic fantasy, but very different from the epic fantasy that we were used to at the time. And this was pretty groundbreaking in a way. It inspired a lot of other writers to write their own dark fantasy books, their own grim and dark fantasy books. Grim dark became a thing, whatever the hell grim dark is. Very, very inspirational, this series by George R.R. Martin. And this first book was really, really good. You probably are familiar at least with the plot because of this television show that came out a few years ago. It came out, ran a few years, and then went away quite badly, I hear. I hear the conclusion was not great on the show. Who knows what the conclusion would be to this book series? We probably will never know. So George R.R. Martin is hard at work, apparently, on the next to last book of A Song of Ice and Fire. That's really why I think it will never be finished. I think there is a chance that the current book will be finished and that will be published. But if that doesn't end the series, there's no way... There's no way that we'll ever get another one after that completed. The way it's going, I just can't see it. Anyway, that hardly matters because what we have gotten has been pretty good. I can say that for sure for at least the first 2 books. This one was really excellent. It is famous now for being unpredictable and for having characters that you could get very attached to and then could just be slaughtered. Which was a surprise back when I first read this. Hard to imagine, but I did read this before the show came out. When the show came out, I think I watched the first episode of the show. I've only seen one episode of A Game of Thrones, the show. And that was because I thought, you know what, I'm not going to watch this show because I'm going to want to read the rest of these books. And I don't want the way I picture what happens in the book to be influenced by what happens in the television show. I don't want to picture the characters like I would picture them from the show. I want to, have my own view of them. And that's sort of impossible now. Even though I've never seen an episode of the show other than the one that I watched, which was the premiere. I know so much about that show just from existing in the world. It's hard not to hear tons and tons of stuff about Game of Thrones. It's just, for a while there, it was just everywhere. And so I know stuff that I wouldn't have wanted to know just from, existing in the world with that television show. Which is a shame, because I think now, for a lot of people going to this book, if they've never read the book, they're probably going to it because they saw the show. So they will never have that experience of, just picking up this book before that existed. It was a great book. Multiple characters, great characters. The character work in this book is awesome. Unique situations, it felt like at the time in a fantasy novel. We had crazy stuff, and crazy and unpredictable stuff happening. All very well written, very well done by George R.R. Martin. Excellent writer who began his career as a science fiction writer. Then he became a horror writer. Then he wrote horror science fiction. His great story, Sand Kings, will be forever anthologized. As long as anthologies exist, Sand Kings will be in every anthology because it's a great story. But he really made his fortune with this. I suspect it probably went from being a wonderful thing to being kind of a curse for the poor guy, because he seems to be having trouble nowadays trying to complete this series. And I think if he were really into it, it wouldn't be that much trouble. It could be that he just wrote himself into a hole and is having a hard time getting out of it. It could be that there's extra pressure because of the television show and the lackluster ending to the television show, from what I hear. It could be a lot of things. But he's not getting any younger, Mr. Martin. And unless he really picks up the pace, this will be a series without an ending. And that sucks, but I don't think it should influence how you feel about the books that have been written. These are books of exceptionally high quality, which is why people love them so much. I don't love these books as much as a lot of people do. I like them an awful lot, the books that I've read, the first two. I doubt this will ever be my favorite fantasy series. It's a bit too cynical and overall a bit joyless. So because of that, I don't think it'll ever be my favorite series, but it's pretty great. And this first book just grabs you and sucks you in and just keeps you reading. And it's a magnificent book, a great fantasy. And if you haven't read it or are avoiding reading it because of the show or because it's not finished or because it probably will never be finished, maybe read it anyway. Because as a book, it's pretty great, And if we never get a conclusion to the Song of Ice and Fire, we could still be happy with what we have gotten. And this book is great. This has a great cover, by the way. There's Jon Snow, who apparently knows nothing. He knows nothing, I hear. But he's on the cover of this book as he looked before he was on television. And this cover here, I forget who does this cover. Let's see if I could find out. If I could read it, because I don't have my glasses are in the other room. I'm a genius. Let's see. Cover art, Stephen Yule. So Stephen Yule did the cover for this. This was back before fantasy books got crappy covers. There was a time, a long time actually, when if you bought a fantasy book, it probably had an awesome cover. Nowadays, you get like a sword hilt or an axe head, something lame like that. And then, of course, we're moving into a future where we're probably just getting stupid AI images for our fantasy cover art. Horrors. But there was a time we got great cover art, and, like this. One of the reasons I like this paperback so much, and it'll probably remain my only copy of this book because I'm very fond of it. Yeah, I've got the first 3 books, I think, like this. But yeah, I'm going to get back to this series. I have, of course, realized, there's no reason to wait for the conclusion of this saga, because it ain't happening. But what we've got is excellent. Highly recommended. A Game of Thrones. It's fantastic. I'll shut up now, and I will catch you next time.